All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty big, I guess you could say. We're looking at the question, do Catholics and Orthodox Christians worship the same God? And, at first glance you might think, well, yeah, obviously they're both Christian, but it's actually way more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
We have this article we're looking at today, and it really digs into how different their theology is. And it kind of comes to this conclusion that, maybe because their theology is so different, they might actually be worshiping two different gods.
Exactly.
Which is kind of a wild thought to get your head around.
Yeah, it's definitely not just like a denominational difference, like, oh, you like this kind of music and we like this kind of music. It really gets into, as you said, the theology, which then, of course, informs all the practices, the beliefs about salvation.
Right.
It's way more foundational.
Oh, that's like which church you go to on Sunday.
Exactly, yeah.
So how does this article break down these differences? Like, what's the approach here for saying that these two theologies are so different?
Yeah, so one of the things the article points out is that the Catholic Church believes that being Catholic is essential for salvation.
Okay.
So you need to be a part of this specific church to be saved.
And that's pretty different from what how the Orthodox view it.
Absolutely. The Orthodox Church, while still believing that the church is very important, they don't believe it's limited to one denomination.
Yeah. So that's a pretty big difference right there off the bat.
Huge.
When you're talking about salvation.
Absolutely.
What other kind of key things does the article point to as examples of these differences?
So another big one, it's a little jargony, but it's called the filioque.
Okay.
And it sounds more complicated than it is. Essentially, it's this small addition to the Nicene Creed, which is, a statement of faith for Christianity.
Okay. So what did they add?
They added the phrase, and the Son, to the part about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father.
Okay.
And it might seem minor, but it actually reveals this huge divide in how Catholics and Orthodox Christians view the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay, so I'm interested now, break it down. How does and the Son make that big of a difference?
Well, so adding and the Son was initially intended to emphasize Jesus' divinity.
Okay.
However, it actually shifted the Western or Catholic understanding of the Trinity. It led to the Holy Spirit being seen more as this intermediary between the Father and the Son, rather than sharing in the Father's essence as the source of the Godhead.
So instead of clarifying things, it actually made it more confusing.
You could say that. Yeah. The Orthodox Church sees the Father as the sole source of the Godhead. Jesus and the Holy Spirit are divine because they share in the Father's essence, not as separate entities.
Right. So that's one example, it seems like, of, maybe a small difference on paper.
Yeah.
But it represents this huge gulf in their theology. Are there any others that the article talks about?
Definitely. So the article then dives into how Catholics and Orthodox Christians view God's presence in the world.
Okay.
And how we actually experience God.
Okay.
So Catholics have this concept of God's divine simplicity.
Divine simplicity, that sounds a little, I don't know, like almost an oxymoron when you're talking about God's divine simplicity.
It's a little counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But essentially it means that God's essence and existence are one and the same.
Oh.
You can only know God through creation and through his grace.
So you can't really know God, but you can see the effects of God.
Exactly.
Okay.
The Orthodox Church, on the other hand, has this concept of God's energies.
Okay.
Which is a way of explaining how God can be both unknowable in his essence and yet still knowable and experienceable in the world.
Okay. So how do they define those energies?
They believe these energies are distinct from God's essence, but they emanate from him. They're how we experience God directly. So think about the Transfiguration, where Christ was bathed in radiant light. The Orthodox would say that light was a manifestation of God's energies.
Okay. Interesting. So it's like God's still unknowable.
In his essence?
But we can get these little glimpses, these little pieces of him.
Exactly. It makes him a little more tangible, would you say?
Yeah, I guess so. Interesting. Yeah, we can't, touch the sun, but we can feel its warmth.
Exactly. A very good analogy.
Yeah.
And, this difference in how Catholics and Orthodox Christians experience God.
Yeah.
It even comes up in how they view Mary and the saints.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit, because I feel like that's always an area where I'm kind of unclear on exactly how the differences play out. They both clearly revere Mary.
Absolutely.
But it seems like there are some pretty big differences there.
For sure. So, for example, There's the Immaculate Conception in Catholicism,
Right.
which is the belief that Mary was conceived without original sin.
Okay.
And that is a core Catholic belief.
Right.
The Orthodox Church, however, they don't believe in the Immaculate Conception.
Okay, so what's their view?
Instead, they believe in the concept of Mary as the first redeemed human.
Oh.
So in the Orthodox view, Mary was cleansed of sin at the moment she became the Theotokos,
Okay.
Mother of God.
So not without sin from the very beginning,
Right.
but cleansed at a particular point in time.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting.
And this actually speaks to, I think, a really beautiful concept in Orthodoxy called theosis.
Theosis, what is that?
Theosis is this idea that humans can gradually become more like God
Oh, wow.
through Christ,
Oh,
sharing in his divine likeness.
okay.
And for the Orthodox, Mary is like the ultimate example of theosis.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about, Mary being sinless. It's about this journey
Exactly.
of becoming closer to God that she embodies.
And which all Orthodox Christians aspire to as well.
Wow. That's very interesting.
It really gets at, I think, the heart of what it means to be both human and divine in the Orthodox faith.
Right.
And this difference in how they view Mary, it even extends to how they think about the veneration of the saints.
Okay. So how does that play out?
So the article mentions the Catholic practice of venerating things like the Sacred Heart of Jesus
Right.
and the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
And this is something that the Orthodox Church doesn't really agree with?
Yeah, they find this a little bit problematic.
Okay.
Because it kind of goes back to that idea of God's divine simplicity.
Right.
And by extension, the unified nature of Christ.
Okay.
So venerating specific body parts, even those of Christ,
Yeah.
can be seen as kind of dividing his nature.
Oh, interesting. So they would say you venerate Christ, but not pieces of Christ.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
Like you wouldn't, I don't know, venerated a piece of clothing or something.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So it seems like all these differences, from the filioque to the Immaculate Conception to the veneration of the saints, it's all coming back to, just different interpretations of who God is, how he interacts with the world.
Yeah. And so it kind of begs the question, can we really say that Catholics and Orthodox Christians worship the same God when their understanding of who God is so vastly different?
Right.
It's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah. So does this article offer any hope for reconciliation? Is there anything in here about whether these two branches of Christianity could ever see eye to eye?
So the article does mention ecumenism, which is this movement to try to reunite Christian churches.
Right.
So in this case, finding that common ground between Catholics and Orthodox Christians.
Okay.
The author seems a little bit skeptical, honestly.
Okay.
The article suggests that true unity can only come if these theological differences are really acknowledged and addressed, not just brushed under the rug.
So, no more agree to disagree.
Essentially, yeah.
Really hash it out.
Yeah, exactly. We need to really grapple with these differences if there's any hope for genuine unity.
Which, I can see how that could be kind of a long shot. When these differences are so deeply rooted.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And they're not just different when it comes to themselves, right?
I mean, the article points out that they also have different views on how they should interact with other faiths.
Yeah, there's this tension around how each branch views other faiths.
What do they have to say about that?
So the article mentions that the Catholic Church seems to be a little more open to dialogue with other Abrahamic faiths, like Muslims and Jews.
Because they all share that common connection to Abraham.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the Orthodox Church, they see that as problematic.
Okay.
Because for them, those theological distinctions that we've been discussing, they're crucial. Maintaining those boundaries is really important for true faith.
Right. So it's not just about finding unity within Christianity. It's also about how they view themselves in the context of a larger religious landscape.
Exactly. That's a major point of divergence.
It seems like the Orthodox Church, they really prioritize theological purity.
Yeah.
Maintaining the distinctiveness of their beliefs.
Okay.
Whereas the Catholic Church may be a little bit more open to dialogue and finding common ground with other faiths.
So it's almost like they're coming at it from fundamentally different perspectives on what religion even is.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Interesting.
And I think according to the article, until those core differences are addressed, any attempts at unification are going to be kind of shaky.
Right, like built on a foundation of sand almost.
Exactly.
Okay, so where does this leave us then? We came in asking, do Catholics and Orthodox Christians worship the same God? And it seems like we've just opened this huge can of
Yeah, I
worms.
was going to say, that's the thing about these deep dives, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes what seems like a simple question on the surface turns out to be way more complicated
Right.
than we could have imagined.
Yeah, and I would say this is definitely one of those cases. It's amazing, right? How much rides on these questions of theology. You know, it's not just like an academic debate. It really changes
Right.
how they view the world, how they interact with other faiths.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, and it really highlights that even within Christianity, there is this huge diversity of thought.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not like one is right and one is wrong.
Right.
It's just,
It's about perspective.
yeah, and appreciating that within this one umbrella, there are these really different ways of approaching it.
For sure.
I think for me, just having done this deep dive, I'm going to look at those icons and those statues a little differently now, knowing all the thought and the history that's behind it.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of the beauty of these conversations, right?
Yeah.
It challenges our assumptions and
That's it. Yeah.
opens us up to new ways of seeing things.
Exactly. So for anybody listening, we've really dug into some pretty dense stuff today.
Yeah, we have.
About how Catholics and Orthodox Christians, while they share that Christian label, they really have some fundamental disagreements. About God, about Mary, about the saints.
Yes.
About how to interact with other faiths, about salvation.
Questions.
Yeah. And I think it all comes back to how they understand God, what God is, what his essence is, if he has energies, how those work. It's fascinating. And it really shows you how much one little change, like adding the sun to the Nicene Creed, can have these huge ripple effects.
Absolutely.
And lead to these really distinct branches of Christianity. So, you know.
What did you find most compelling? What do you think about these differences? Does the idea of God's energies make sense to you? Or are you more on the side of divine simplicity? It's a lot to think about. But we hope that this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about these two branches of Christianity. And if this is something you're interested in, there is so much out there that you can read. So many different arguments on this topic. It's something that people have been debating for centuries. Yeah. So keep those deep dives going.
And we will be back next time with another one for you. See you later.